Thank you, DJ Ton, for the playlist and the beats for tonight's show. Welcome everyone to Accented Dialogues on Diaspora. My name is Philip Nguyen. I'm your co-host, and today we'll have the honor of speaking with Barbara Jane Reyes and Karen Llagas for our show on letters and lullabies. In case you didn't know, if this is your first time or your 54th time with us, since this is our 54th episode of Accented Dialogues on Diaspora, Accented is a production of the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network, or DVAN. DVAN's mission is to amplify diasporic Vietnamese and Southeast Asian literary voices. We empower artists in the diaspora and champion our complex and diverse stories, ensuring that our perspectives reshape and expand the broader cultural narrative. You can learn more about what we do at the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network by visiting dvan.org or by checking us out on Instagram and Facebook at Instagram or Facebook.com/we are_DVAN. This accented Dialogues in Diaspora podcast. We're recording it live here on Zoom with you all. It's also available, and all of our episodes are available as podcast episodes on Apple Music, Spotify, and wherever it is that you get your podcasts. So excited to join you all on this hot summer, winter, almost spring day. I have the honor of introducing Mr. Viet Thanh Nguyen, who is the Pulitzer Prize winning author of The Sympathizer, its sequel, The Committed, and his memoir, A Man of Two Faces, a memoir, a history, and a memorial. He's also a children's books co-author, a university professor at USC, a co-founder of DVAN, in addition to being a co-host for Accented. Welcome back, Viet, to Accented. How are you doing tonight?
Hey, Philip, it's great to be back here with you. How am I doing? Not good right now.
Word.
It's March 19th, 2026, and the United States is in the middle of yet another war, this time in Iran, with the aid or the assistance or the manipulation of Israel. Who knows exactly what's going on? And this is a show about the Southeast Asian diaspora in the United States and overseas. And this diaspora, in many ways, wouldn't have existed without American wars and colonization and interventions throughout Asia, including Southeast Asia. That would involve you and me, Philip, and it would involve our two guests tonight who hail from the Philippines. And if you think about Asia as something that is this vast expanse that extends all the way from Southeast and East Asia to West and Southwest Asia, then you realize that what's been happening in the so-called Middle East for the last several decades is, in fact, a part of what connects all of us as Asians together. The idea that we're connected by culture, possibly it's ephemeral, but the idea that we're connected because of how we've been affected by Western colonialism and war, that is a reality. And the interventions or the wars or the colonizations that the U.S. has conducted in Southeast Asia have been stepping stones towards what the West has called the Middle East and what I think now is more accurately called West and Southwest Asia. So how do I feel? I feel enraged, I feel terrified, I feel frustrated, because my feeling about war is that war is not over and done with when ceasefires are declared and signed. I feel that the war in Vietnam, although it was officially over, is just one episode in a much longer history of American warfare that connects the Philippines to Korea, to Vietnam, to Cambodia, to Laos, and now to the so-called Middle East with Iran, Afghanistan, and Iraq. So I am just trying to make these connections in order for us to understand how we're all linked together. That's really depressing and terrifying in some ways, but hopefully if we can make the connections, we also know how to make connections with each other in order to illuminate, to analyze, to resist. And I think some of those linkages will be happening tonight with our two guests as well. So our first guest tonight is Karen Llagas. She is the author of two poetry collections, All of Us Are Cleaved and Archipelago Dust. She has translated Filipino children's books into English, including How Do You Eat Color? And she teaches Filipino at my alma mater, UC Berkeley. Hi, Karen. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you for having us.
Our other guest is Barbara Jane Reyes, who was born in Manila and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. She is an acclaimed Filipino-American poet and author of several books, including Letters to a Young Brown Girl, Invocation to Daughters, and others. Her most recent book is Daughtersong Diaspore. Welcome, Barbara. I
Thank
thought
you
I
so
would.
much for having me. I appreciate being here.
Terrific. We know each other from a long time back, so it's
Yes, we
fabulous to be
do.
back here with you on screen. I started off talking about the war in Iran as one of the things that's been happening. I forgot to mention that just 3 days ago was March 16th, which was the anniversary of the My Lai massacre in 1968 when U.S. soldiers killed 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, men, women, and children, and raped some of them. And March 16th was also the anniversary of the mass shooting in Atlanta in 2021, in which a white gunman killed 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women. And in my mind, these events are connected. I'm bringing them up simply because they share the same anniversary, but they are connected in terms of demonstrating how deep set the violence is that is embedded in this country that's directed towards Asians of various nationalities, whether it's overseas in Asia or whether it's here in the United States, and how that violence intersects also with gender and misogyny, and how all of these things are inextricable from each other. So here we are in the Southeast Asian diaspora as people from Vietnam and from the Philippines, and also as Americans as well, confronting these kinds of issues. And the most recent tragedy that has been unveiled as of yesterday has been this revelation for some of us, not all of us, but revelation for some of us, that the iconic hero of the farm labor movement, Cesar Chavez, has been accused fairly credibly, from what it seems to be reported, of rape, of child molestation, of grooming, of impregnating his co-worker and co-icon Dolores Huerta twice, and that he's been the father of at least 4 illegitimate children outside of the bonds of his marriage. Now, for those of us who are not aware of Cesar Chavez's complicated history, and apparently there were rumors of this in the last few decades, but for those of us who are not aware, it's been devastating to see these kinds of revelations, because I, like many others, was brought up to think of Cesar Chavez as a hero of the labor movement, of Chicanos, of Filipinos, of Latinos, someone who really transformed our understanding of labor and organizing and race and class in the United States. And there is a Filipino angle to all of this as well. But I thought I would open up by asking you what your reactions are to this most recent revelation, because I think your work as poets and as activists and as teachers does touch on many of the issues that Cesar Chavez's work raises, but also his reputation and his legacy are intertwined with the lives of Filipinos and Filipinas in the United States as well. So, Karen, what have your reactions been to this news?
Deeply saddened, sad and enraged, and also very much on the deflation, because I know it's one more thing that may be used as weapon against our community, and against the efforts around labor organizing, um, and collective empowerment. But I also have to say, we do have this tendency to attribute so much credit into one person, especially if it is a male authority figure. And I've seen this repeated in many social movements, in many revolutionary movements, even in the Philippines, and I think it's also a moment of reflection of going, there are certain events that we see in history and they're documented in photographs, Itliong photographed so many times with Chavez. And I was just reading before this event of his son speaking to this um, to this scandal. But it's the same. That is a moment, but underneath it are all the countless labors of other activists, of women leaders that were never quite given that much significance or exposure. So many complicated reactions and feelings.
Thanks. Barbara, what about you?
Yeah, thank you for bringing up all of this context. I was telling you folks earlier that my immediate reaction is really just kind of rage and disappointment. And the fact that I'm not even surprised how unsurprised I am having heard the news. That said, I feel like I want to always be kind of focused on the survivors. I think we spend a lot of time talking about the perpetrator and not enough time, right, and energy kind of holding up the survivors. And that's kind of where I'm at now, that we've spent so much time upholding these charismatic patriarchal figures and just not enough energy, always just kind of focusing on the fact that, these girls have borne a lot of pain and a lot of shame. And I want us to sit with that and really appreciate that before anything.
The word survivor is very compelling because I think in one way, everybody who's in the diaspora, who's been a refugee, is a survivor of war, of the experience of crossing over into the United States, and of many other issues. But then, very specifically, the fact that women have been the victims of people like Chavez complicates and multiplies these issues of surviving the violence, not just of racism and colonialism and war, but also of patriarchy and heteronormativity as well. And in both of your work, part of what I love about what you do is that you are committed poets, but that your poetry is about art, obviously, but is also about the social and political realities in which you were raised and in which you're living right now. Karen, how has history and these social and political realities of what it means to be a Filipina or an Asian American, how have those infiltrated their way into your life as a poet and a teacher?
Oh gosh, we just started with the most difficult questions. They're inevitable, right? I think we were talking earlier. No, actually, I was looking at the questions, and I would say one of the questions was, what is most urgent for you to write into at the moment? And I'll just combine that with a question that you just asked, Viet, because I think those questions are very related, which is, like, rage is just one of the things we feel, and sometimes I'm just surprised that I also feel joy, and I also feel tenderness towards my community. And towards everybody who's suffering, actually, and then on the other hand, just having to generate so much energy to still be present to my students, to be present to, Filipino American Book Festival is happening this year, the huge collective organizing effort that happens there. So all of this to say that I lean a lot on other people to keep me going, whether that be in my poetry or whether that be in my teaching or community organizing. That I think that's one thing that I have to thank my being Filipino for. Like, it's almost natural to go, but you don't need to do any of this by yourself, right? The world is really falling apart, and in a way we can fall apart together, but also we can work towards imagining a better world together.
Barbara, I know you have a lot to say about this question.
I have a lot to say. Can you repeat part of your question at least? Because I'm going all kinds of places in my head about this.
How we've been talking about so many complicated histories around war, colonialism, racism, patriarchy, rape, and they're inseparable from each other, as we all know that. I mean, it's impossible for us to focus on just one issue when we as diasporic subjects and peoples have been created out of a maelstrom of histories and oppressions and movements of liberation and joy, as Karen brought up. But pick one way into it, of these complicated social and political realities, because I know that your poetry grapples with this kind of complication.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. One thing that I was going to say that I've been thinking about is that I'm a suburban kid, right? I grew up in Fremont, and I moved here when I was very, very young. So I was 2 years old, and I feel like that gives a lot of people permission to tell me I'm not really Filipino, or I don't remember what it's like to be Filipino. And in many ways, they are right. And I'm not saying that to be self-effacing as much as I want to say that I am kind of a different animal than I am, whatever one's expectation of being a Filipino might be. I did grow up in a very kind of, safe and quiet kind of place where we tried very hard just to be American kids. And so Now that, I've been writing and writing and publishing for decades now, I feel like, this is the place where, all my studying, all of my thinking about and reading about where I come from, and even just the land that I inhabit, has a deep Filipino history. You cannot think of Fremont and Niles and the Bay Area and California without thinking about the workers. And since I'm literary, I always go back to like America is at the Heart by Carlos Bulosan, and just, whereas there was always this question of where I came from, I always want to say my people have always been here. They've been here a very long time. Um, yeah, I don't know that that answers your question as much as just kind of gives you an idea of where I've been sitting for the past, at least through the writing of these last couple of books. I'm here, and this is what I am, and it's imperfect, and it's kind of um, not really Filipino, but it's the best that I can do. You know.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing that. I'm very interested. I think to see the way in which we understand the journey between the Philippines to the Bay and to California as a whole. And I think, I mean, just thinking about what Viet mentioned earlier and the legacy or what's left of the legacy of Cesar Chavez, to also understand that the United Farm Workers movement, the sort of invisibilization and marginalization of Filipino farm workers during that same time. As someone who, Go Bears, also came from ethnic studies at UC Berkeley and then ended up in San Francisco. I want to ask you both about what about the Bay Area, or if it at all, the sort of social political activism that the sort of vibe of the Bay Area, how much of that informs your work, your writing, your teaching. Barbara, I'll start with you.
All right, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. UC Berkeley, ethnic studies as well, holler. Um, Yay.
The
Yeah, thank you
OGs.
for that. I wouldn't have ever gotten into the arts had it not been for my local Phil-Am Arts community here. I was immediately plugged into Kearney Street Workshop and the now defunct Bay Area Filipino American Writers Org, BayPA, in the 90s. And, I had people like Manong Al Robles, who was always there to just story tell and listen and just encourage and just be, the example of, you know, a Filipino that I could be more like, rather than what it was that, my family and my community and my parents' church were trying to kind of mold me into a different kind of image of a good daughter, right? But instead, there were these poets, and they were the descendants of the folks who worked the land, and they grew up in this place, and we're just writing all kinds of just wild and passionate stuff. And without that, I could not have ever become this. Um,
Yeah. Karen, what about you? What brought you into poetry, into the arts, to California? Can you share a little bit about your journey?
That's that's so beautiful. I'm just appreciating Barbara's answer. And I feel like at some point our paths met. I grew up in the Philippines. I came here 1999. I was 21. And usually when Filipino writers talk about coming to the US, they say I was already a fully formed adult, as a first generation. But I really feel that I've done so much growth in my both spiritual, literary, and political consciousness in the Bay Area. Like I would have been a completely different writer and poet had I stayed in the Philippines, and its kind of problematic relationship with English and American centric literature and lineage and all of that. But being in the Bay, you're shaped by it, but it's also a place where you get to shape that conversation. And I love that. And I love that environment of Filipino Americans and Filipinos now who grew up in the Philippines coming together in San Francisco and going, what are the issues that are common to us? What are the issues that are quite unique for this group of people? For me, it's very special to learn about the labor movement in California. I still go take students very often to the Philippines, and we go visit workers there and farming communities, and I see how across the ocean these issues around freedom and rights and human rights are so connected. But yeah, I'm just really it's a gift to be part of this community and this history.
So I had the privilege and the joy of visiting Manila before the pandemic for the National Book Festival and met some Filipino writers, like Filipino. They were living in the Philippines, of course, and getting the sense that there is a little bit of a difference, obviously, between Filipino literature in the Philippines and Filipino American literature. It's a long, rich history between the two, but also maybe some tensions as well, specifically around an implication in Barbara's comment that maybe Filipino Americans are not authentic in relationship to the Philippines. At least you might feel that way personally. And that, has a lot of resonance for me because some of the same tensions exist, I think, probably for every population, but I certainly have felt like an inauthentic Vietnamese American. The Philippine situation is actually really interesting because the history of colonization is so much more intimate, and Filipinos, one of the languages is English. So there's a kind of a different connection to the United States and the Filipino diaspora there. But let's start with Karen, because I did not realize that you came here when you were 21. You were a full grown adult. You were already Filipino before you came to the United States. Was it an adjustment process, or did the long-term Americanization already hit you in the Philippines, so you felt you were ready when you got here?
It's still a shock. It's a shock. You think because you have a version of the US in the Philippines, right? You get the shows. Hi. You get shows, you get songs, pop songs and pop artists that are Americans. You get very Americanized, right? But here you don't realize, especially for somebody like me who's expected coming from a certain university and finishing economics and going, but I don't want to be a business person. But, it took me a while to go, I don't want to be on this path, but I guess I have to be on this path because I'm 21 and I just got here, and many of the people I'm meeting at that time of my life was also graduate students coming from the Philippines who are here, and of course you have certain resources, right? If that's the path of coming to San Francisco and to the US. Yeah, it's I could have stayed. To Barbara's point, I could have stayed in that path. I could have stayed quite insulated with a very much a settler immigrant story of you come here, you try to do as best as you can economically and materially. It's just there was a huge part of me that was not interested in doing that. you know.
I mean, many of the same stereotypes that apply to other Asians apply to Filipinos too. And the pressures, obviously, of professionalization and so on. But Barbara, you knew you wanted to be a writer from a very early time. You talk about this in your most recent book, that you were, as a young person, already running off to bookstores like City Lights and falling in love with poetry and wanting to be a poet yourself, which I presume made you an oddity within the Filipino American community. But at the same time, even as a Filipino American poet, you say that you feel inauthentic in relationship to, I assume, people from the Philippines in addition to the Filipino American community. Is that an accurate way of portraying part of your emergence?
I think so. Yeah, thank you for that. I feel like, I'm this Pinay author and I teach in Philippine studies at USF, and yet I'm always kind of socially and casually kind of excluded from conversations among Filipinos about Filipino things, right? Because my language skills are not very good. I didn't grow up speaking Tagalog or Ilocano, and one thing that I did write about was asking my mother why she and my father never taught us the language. And her answer was non-answer, right? So there really is no kind of other way of thinking about why would you raise your children in a language that is not your primary language, unless you want them to be something else that is different than you, right? And that is that road to success that Karen were talking about. So so I feel like already having come from the suburbs, I mean, the suburbs are dull. I'm sorry to say, but it's, culture is flattened and there's no space to go to explore, right? And so my girlfriends and I, we're all brown girls, going to the record store after school was like a big rebellion, or even just spending extra time in the public library and reading way above our level, but still wanting to find something else other than this flattened, suburban culture. That's kind of where we were at, and it is kind of no coincidence for me that it was, that we were these little kind of misfit brown girls that just didn't want to have anything to do with, social popularity and social success. It was painful because we never did fit in and we were never cool anyway. And so it was very important, at least for me, to just kind of be exploring what were other people in the world like and doing and thinking about and writing about. And when I got old enough to get on a BART train by myself, of course, coming up to Berkeley or going to City Lights became, my escape from Fremont. Yeah.
Well, I grew up in San Jose, and Fremont actually was on my radar because Fremont seemed actually a little more cosmopolitan because you had a BART station. The BART system, for those of you who don't know the Bay Area, the BART is our rapid transit system, that didn't go past Fremont to San Jose. So I had to take the bus from San Jose out to Fremont if I wanted to go into the cooler parts of the Bay Area, which unfortunately for me were just more suburban parts. So I actually sort of envied the Filipinos I knew who were in Fremont at the time. Now, we share this sort of South Bay, suburban, angsty background, Barbara. And when I went to Berkeley, became immediately an angry Asian American, as all the stuff that had been hidden from me in suburbia sort of got peeled back by Asian American studies professors and my reading and so on, and more broadly in ethnic studies as well. And one of the things I love about your work is that you're unapologetically angry. I mean, there's lots of other emotions that are going on in your work, but the most recent book, for example, Daughtersong Diaspore, is full of these really intense emotions. You named grief and sorrow, but also rage. And there's so much that you're raging against there. And you could argue that that's either against suburbia, or suburbia just covers over the rage that's underneath the surface, as many suburban artists have pointed out. So I don't know if you want to answer that question about rage and anger as key motivations in your work, and how that's driven you and how you deal with that in your poetry.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I feel like when I was younger, it was a lot easier for elder folks, especially elder Filipino women, to say, why is she so angry all the time? That kind of pearl clutching, there's something very kind of unbecoming about a girl who is so angry. But I think you are right that, the suburban gloss over that kind of, any kind of expression of emotion that is authentic and unsanctioned, right, is very easy to just kind of, not even gloss over, but just kind of grossly pave over, right? And so I feel like poetry was the place for that. Poetry, and then, punk rock as well. Poetry was the place for that for me. Like picking up Howl was, something that I needed to do. Allen Ginsberg's Howl, and spend time with that. And for I don't like answering the question, why are you so angry? I feel like the question I would like to ask back is, why are you not so angry? Especially since we began this talk with all of these things that are happening in our world and in our country, and to people that we have respected and revered. And there is plenty to be angry about. And I have to tell you, the other day I picked up Khalil Gibran's The Prophet again, of all things, and was reading about like pain and joy, and how those are, two things inextricably tied to one another, right? And so when Karen talks about joy and community, I feel like that's kind of the flip side of being so angry all the time, is feeling deeply, right?
And out of feeling deeply, we can form new communities if the communities we come from, whether it's our families or our ethnic communities or suburbia, aren't enough for us. Now, Karen, your most recent book, the title is All of Us Are Cleaved. And when I see that word in the context of poetry, I think automatically to Li Young Lee's poem, The Cleaving, which was influential on me and on so many of us. For those of you who haven't read The Cleaving, it's this beautiful poem in which Li Young Lee looks at a butcher in Chinatown, and the butcher is using his cleaver to cleave a duck in two, and Li Young Lee riffs on that idea of the duality of cleaving, that it's something that splits us apart, but also something that brings us together. And that image was so powerful that the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network, which puts on this show and of which I'm a part, the co-executive director Isabel Thuy Palot, the poet Lan Yung, and myself edited a volume that we called The Cleaving, Vietnamese Writers in Dialogue, to give homage to Li Young Lee, but to reinforce this idea of how powerful cleaving is as literally a double-edged metaphor for the diasporic experience. Now, I have no idea if you had any of that in mind as you were coming up with the title for your collection, but if that's not the case, then where does this title, All of Us Are Cleaved, comes from?
Thank you for that question. I actually have that book, but I got that book after my collection came out. So I go, oh, yes, they also use the word cleave. Of course, I love the nature that it's of that word as a contronym, those dual opposite meanings. I have to say though that it's my very awkward translation of a line I love in a Filipino novel. And I'm gonna read it in Filipino just so for those uh, who who understand, but it's okay if it's not. Lahat tayo hati, hindi nga lang nakakalipad ang iba. It's from a novel by Ricky Lee, and it basically said, in a very literal translation, all of us are divided, but some of us have wings. And I go, divided is not it. It's cleaved because we're both divided and together. Um, and that Filipino word hati, it actually means to divide, but it's also to share. So it's much closer to cleaving. And I think I've always had that experience that what I think divides us is also somehow what brings us together. So rage divides us, anger, but it actually, if we allow rage and to rage collectively, is actually also something that can bring us together. It's a fire for action, and I love what you said, Barbara, that we cannot have that. We cannot have the joy if we're also not allowing those of us who are angry. It's also such a gift, because I'm one who probably repress anger. And so to have people around me who I admire, whose work I read and follow, kind of like come up and supplement that emotion it's very healing for us artists as to experience that together. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Karen, and for sharing invoking a little bit of Tagalog into this conversation. For those of y'all who are joining us in this conversation, my name is Philip Nguyen. I'm here with Viet Thanh Nguyen. We are the co-hosts of Accented Dialogues and Diaspora, and we're joined today for Letters and Lullabies, featuring the poets Karen Llagas and Barbara Jane Reyes. Karen and Barbara, we also I think our audience would be uh, honored to hear a little bit of some of your work if you we had asked you to prep some pieces in advance of this show to share with our audience in case they haven't heard of your work or had a chance to read it yet. If you wouldn't mind sharing some of that. Um, I'm like looking at y'all to see who might be prepared first. But I think Karen, since you had just shared a snippet in Tagalog, I wanted to maybe go with you first. If you could uh, share your works with us and which collection is it from?
Okay, I will share maybe two short poems from the collection. Um, I'm going to share this poem called Pre-Departure. You are going to a country where you can have a human shape without being such. It's a simple enough premise. Learn the phrase, a human is here. It means more than your name. You ask, is there anything we can be but human? This country is home to forest guardians, duendes, shapeshifters. Tao po, repeat it, accent on the last syllable. What you say, who you say it to, opens doors. Tao po. You will announce you're a person outside someone's gate, what the visited will hear before they let you in. Our country is a beauty mark on the Pacific's cheek. Everyone you'll meet would have said it. The dirt poor, the dirt wealthy. The paramilitary says it, then waits for the targeted to open their door. Claim your tongue, no matter how flawed. You must shapeshift again, again, and again. And I'm actually going to read something that is not in that collection, but I'm working towards a full-length collection. And a lot of it is around being in California and being California Filipino American in this moment in time. And the one that opens that collection is called Praise the Fire. Praise the fire, the canyon it cleared, the dire, the dry, the coast below, the godwits and the snowy egrets, the silver glitter that dusted the rose bushes the few seconds before our eyes discerned it as ash. I paused to praise all the ways I could not have been here today. There's a mysterious pill one New Year's Eve years ago, getting into a stranger's car after being lost on a trail in Mount Tam, and one more time in rural France. There was a spinning rock on the drive back from Black Rock. The lies I told the police to keep an ex-lover's brother from being deported. Oh, the effigy, how big the flames, how seductive. Praise choosing the same regrets over, burning the same bridges, the town towards you, the cinders. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. Ooh. Just sitting with it, just yes, beautiful, beautiful poems. Thank you so much for sharing with our audience and our listeners for Accented. Barbara, I will pass it to you.
Thank you. I'm going to read a short excerpt from this enormous prose poem that is, kind of the big chunk of Daughtersong Diaspore. A prayer. Let my poems carry themselves through the air as Daughtersong Diaspores. Let the wind take my poems wherever the wind will take them. What I know, the terroir. The entire world is this enclosed domestic space here. This is a domain of the father here. This is a domain of the husband here. The narratives that arc and end here. The entire characters that develop and die here. Who has ever escaped the father's dominion here? It is in the taste of the tap water here. It is in the stale air, heavy with the windows always shut here. It is always dim. Sunlight cannot reach the inside of this low-ceilinged space here. The grand sala with its exposed wood beams and clerestory windows feels off-limits here. It is in the sticky texture of the linoleum kitchen floor underfoot here. If we venture outdoors into the backyard's dandelions and thorns overgrown here, the dead grass in the front yard, the sharp, broken, rusted tools here, the chemical smell, the grease-covered objects populating the garage push us back indoors here. There is nowhere to sit and read books in peace here. It is in the oil splatters on the kitchen walls, years of it, decades of it, the smell of it here, TFC on full blast, no one to remember to turn the TV off. I still dream of this house. I still miss this house. I still long for this house. Its sautéed garlic aroma of the curtains and the old rust-colored carpet. Its southpaw fists through the drywall. Sometimes my father's, sometimes mine. What I know. How being silently pissed off is fueling autoimmune disorders in women of color. How a diasporic daughter discloses the disease of her mother, the wordless grief of her mother, how many unspoken dissatisfactions of her mother, the unnamed sadnesses of her mother, how her mother's disease is all our mother's perpetual state of being ill at ease. How observing her mother's peers, she sees similar symptoms and silent inflammations. How a mother may unbecome one cell, one unsettling at a time, right before our eyes. How more diasporic daughters need to recognize. How may we intervene? How many generations of women, how mothers of diasporic daughters unbecome, how unwell, one quelled breath at a time, one after another, after another.
That was lovely. That was powerful. That was moving. I have so many questions for both of you, but let me start with Karen first, because for those listening in on this broadcast at a later date, what you cannot see is that when Karen read her poem and had this phrase, doubtful, people in the comments were quoting that, immediately recognizing what that meant. I have no idea what that meant. And that is fine. That is fantastic, because what's running in both of your works, one theme of it, is this issue of language, what the language is, what language you're working with, what language you come from, what language is being communicated. And in that instance, I think there's a refusal to translate, at least immediately, for you, Karen, as you're talking about a poem in which you're returning to a country in which you're recognized as human. So I'm not going to ask you to translate. I don't actually need that, but I'm interested in the reaction of people who listened to the poem and recognized that phrase. What do you think they recognized? So much so that they had to comment on that in the chat of our show.
I think it's recognizable because it is now nobody shows up unannounced anymore, right? But if you show up in somebody's house, that's what you say. Bao. It's okay. It's one word, person. And what I love about this phrase is that people think what you're saying is there somebody inside? Like that's what you do here in the West, right? Excuse me, is somebody home? But tao po is actually you saying in indigenous culture, Filipino culture, it's you're saying, I'm a person, I'm out here. Can you let me in? And it speaks to there are many creatures, seen and unseen, all around us in the Philippines and in many of these cultures in Southeast Asia. And I think it's both inclusive and mysterious at the same time. And I just love it when I also just learned it and I go, oh my gosh, it's so many layers, and it touches in that kind of mythical, but mythical in the daily sense kind of way.
I think it's beautiful that I didn't get it. I mean, I got a sense of it, but I didn't get it in the way that you described it, because I think what's so powerful about that for people who do get it is that there is no translation needed. I mean, there's similar expressions in Vietnamese. For example, if you say something to a Vietnamese person, they'll immediately know the connotations, the denotations. A certain phrase or a word will evoke an entire cultural universe for Vietnamese people in the Vietnamese language itself. And I think that it did that for some of our Filipino listeners. And part of the reason why it could do that is that you didn't pause it. Just give readers the explanation you just gave us right now, which is helpful. It's a great footnote in a future scholarly edition of the poems, but it's not necessary for the poem to have that power. And in Barbara's case, the question of language is a major theme that runs throughout your collection, but also I think the refusal to translate what's happening in what I heard in what you were describing. There is an intimacy in the descriptions in the poems that evoke something very specific for you, but probably have connotations for other people who can share some of the images that you're describing. Did it take you a long time to get to this moment where you're able to evoke something so specific and so powerful for you without feeling an urge to explain or to translate? Or has that always been something that was a part of you ever since you were a young poet up until the present? Not that you're an old poet, but anyway, you're not 15
I'm an
years
old poet
anymore.
It's okay. Yeah, thank you for that question. I feel like you know what? Many years ago, I did a reading from my second book, Poeta in San Francisco, at the San Jose public library. And a woman that was there was like an Italian woman who came up to me afterwards and she said, I loved everything. I felt like everything about Catholicism was, was so intimate to me. Right. And I thought, so there's a connection there that I had not thought about, even though I did. So I feel like, you write the thing, you describe the thing with all the detail that you can muster to make it, here, the house, you see the house, you feel the house, you feel how claustrophobic it is, you feel how kind of, dingy and kind of stuck everything is in this house. And I've done my job then, right? And maybe this isn't somebody else's experience, but maybe they can feel what I'm, trying to describe here. Or maybe it is really kind of also invoking the spaces, where they grew up with memories that aren't all beautiful, and easy. So I feel like there's that. Just that many, many years ago, somebody did tell me, I am from nowhere, anywhere near you, and I get it. So that has emboldened me. I feel like the level of detail I get to in this collection, I really am only giving myself permission to now, kind of post the passing of both of my parents, where, I've always kind of worried about whether or not they would approve of how much I told the world about my family, you know?
Yeah, I was just about to ask. I was just about to ask you both about that. Like, what has been the reception from your parents or your elders or the community of your work? I mean, I think the act, the resistant act of becoming resistant and rebellious act of becoming a poet is already one thing. But I think for your both of your works to speak to these sort of silences that exist or these ghosts that may or may not be knocking on the door, what has been the reception from the Pinoy Pinay Filipino American community? And does it feel different in community as opposed to if you were to, for example, say speak to a white audience? Karen?
I'm just, I, it's all different levels of reception. Like I think Filipino American communities receive my or our work, our poetries, we as gifts to each other. My sister, and I think she's in the audience, reads my work, and I feel more vulnerable with family, and I always feel, but I don't want my parents are still both alive to read it, but and it's also okay that they don't. I think I'm at a point in my personal and professional development when I go, I'm happy to just be not a poet, like hyphenated, not a poet with my family. It's protective, right? There's a part of me that doesn't have to. There are many parts that get to play in different arenas. So that's one. Although I think part of my path is having be more and more known to all different realms of my life, family, friends, and the wider community. Yeah.
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, so not feeling like you have to be a poet when you're with your family, but there's this extra layer of vulnerability that exists. Barbara, for you.
Yeah, thank you. I think I might always kind of be that weird cousin or that weird tita, which is
From
fine.
from Fremont, from
Oh,
Fremont,
yeah, who
represent.
happens to be from Fremont. Thank you. um, but yeah, I mean, the community is always, they surprise me. They hold me up. Nico just dropped in this wonderful comment about my book helping shape their poetic voice, and so I get, one thing about remaining on social media, regardless of how useless and icky it's become, is just these wonderful connections where a Filipino writer or a Filipino person from who knows where is contacting me to tell me that something I have written has changed them somehow fundamentally. And I could not, I don't know, like, I don't know what to do with that a lot, but I do know that I'm so grateful for that, and that upholds me and that keeps me going. So I feel like that's maybe my answer to community. This is what it is to be a poet. And sometimes I feel like in this country, people don't care about poets. But I remember one time I was in the Philippines and I was visiting like an extended family somewhere in Mindanao. And my mother said, yeah, this is my daughter. She's a poet. And everybody was like, oh, a poet. How wonderful. And there was a whole different kind of cultural idea, about what a poet is. Yeah.
So for our young listeners, folks in the audience who are struggling to become diasporic writers or poets, or they're still looking to find their voice, can I ask both of you to share maybe a bit of advice? And maybe I'll start with you, Barbara, as one of the sort of the OGs. So to say, we've also got a question in the chat on advice for young poets, but also any advice that you have for writing long poems.
For the long poems part is just let yourself be obsessed with the work, you know. The second you kind of second guess yourself, oh my gosh, the mojo, it might just go away. So let yourself, just be in it. And maybe that's terrible advice too, because I know the feeling of having written this book that I just did, and it wasn't pretty. It was pretty awful, but the work was worth it. It's not like I was, self-harming or anything terrible, destructive like that. So I want to say that too, because I feel like I've had young people also kind of ask, do you write to the point of like, self-harm? And I'm like, oh my God, what a terrible, terrible, oh my God, and I was just like, no, I do not. I don't advocate for that. But I definitely advocate for just doing the thing and persisting in doing the thing, regardless of what people are telling you. If they think it's fruitless or dumb or stupid or, no, just do it.
Thank you, Barbara.
Mm-hmm.
Karen, any advice?
My advice, because I started writing for other people, I would say 22, 23. And, in these writing workshops, you always hear something like, write what you know or something. And I'm like, why would I write what I know? I write because I don't know, so that's my advice. Actually, it's a little bit of a variation to that, which is write what irritates you. And I take that the way like a pearl gets irritated and so it's formed, right, inside an oyster, which is write what will not let you go, to speak to Barbara's obsessions. Because I think that's where the energy and the interesting thing is. Otherwise, then you can just lecture about it. And, in many ways, it's much easier to take up teaching, and then you can teach what you know. Teach what you know, and then write what you do not know and what really you're obsessed about.
We have another question from the audience, and I find it to be a really difficult question. Standard poet question says, Nico, what are the biggest icks, ICKS, what are the biggest icks for the upcoming Gen Z poets in the Filipino American writer space, such as Nico? The reason why I think it's a difficult question is because we're not Gen Z. So Nico is asking you to try to figure out what are the biggest icks for a Gen Z poet. I'm not clear whether that means what are the biggest icks for the Gen Z poet themselves, or what are the biggest icks for older poets, since we've established that, we're an older panel right here. What are the biggest icks for an older panel looking at a Gen Z audience or Gen Z poets? You can take that any way you want, but let's start with Barbara here. I think you would be Gen X like myself.
I'm totally Gen X. I think that the biggest icks that I see in poetry is, regardless of the generation, writing for the award or the prize or for the institution, and for and towards whiteness. Those are my icks. The second, I feel like this is not for community. This is mining the pain of community, kind of in this obscene and extractive way. I am not feeling it, and I am putting that down, and I'm not supporting it and talking about it ever again. Thank you for asking.
Karen, what about you? Biggest icks?
I'm so glad you clarified that because as somebody who's constantly in contact with Gen Z, I feel like I'm constantly asking for the approval of this generation in my teaching life. But kidding aside, I seconding Barbara. I mean, you feel it if somebody is, and I don't know that it's conscious. I think if somebody wants to do acrobatics on the page because they want to be perceived a certain way or get a certain award, it's fine. I don't know that I would go as far as a visceral reaction of an ick. It's just that my reaction stays very cerebral, which I can appreciate in this way. It's just not a poet or a poem I will go back to study or to feel more, to expand my consciousness or my feeling, yeah.
Somehow I feel that a Gen X person such as myself saying what kind of icks he gets from Gen Z is probably a big ick for Gen Z. Like, who cares what Gen X has to say to Gen Z? I'm reminded of when I went to Hawaii to give a talk to the University of Hawaii, and afterwards this Gen Z student comes up to me who's Vietnamese American or local Vietnamese and says to me, "Thank you for not embarrassing us Vietnamese people." Okay, so the judgmental levels are high in Gen Z. I feel like that's really where Gen X is facing a real test. I think our two guests tonight, Karen Llagas and Barbara Jane Reyes, these Gen X poets, hopefully have passed the test. They've given us lessons from many decades of life experience as human people, as poets, as activists, as Filipinas, and as Americans as well. And I think that lesson that Barbara stressed, not to write for the white gaze, not to write for approval from the authorities, but to write from some space that is genuine, wherever that happens to be, including in suburbia, where many poets grow up, is crucial. Learning how to find your voice is such a huge challenge for any writer. Learning how to tap into your authenticity, even when you've been deemed inauthentic by certain people, that's a huge challenge for any writer, any poet, any human being. And I'm so grateful to have had Karen and Barbara with us today, especially since we started off talking about very serious and dark parts of the contemporary world. And part of the answer that I wanted for us to get to is that, as immense as our problems are, one of the reasons why we turn to arts in this podcast, Accented, is because art does give us an opportunity to protest, to resist, to express, and in each of our individual and collective ways, that still remains so crucial. So thank you, Karen. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you to our audience. We will see you soon for the next episode of Accented Dialogues in Diaspora.